an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. Look at that. Thursday, October the 19th. And it's an auspicious day on the show. We got a really good guest. And no offense, but that's not why it's an auspicious day on the show. Today, I am a 7-year-old grandfather. 7 years ago today, Piper made me a grandpa. So there we go. Can't believe she's 7 years old. Holy cow. Anyway, she came in on the heels of, I think, Hurricane Nicole back in 16. And I remember trying to navigate the roads around the IWK in Halifax, where they took such good care of her. And the water was up to our wheel wells. So it was if it were a Shakespearean play, it would have been a sign of things to come. So she is a force of nature, our Piper. So happy birthday. And we have good times. Best job in the world. I know our guest will agree with that. Former Premier of the province of Ontario. I'm thinking you're just putting that just below being a grandmother. Kathleen Wynne.
I would say, honestly, quite a bit below.
There you go.
You're right about being a grandparent. Best job in the world. Yesterday, I was actually in my grandson's grade 5 class talking about government, because that's when they talk about government. And it was so cool because every child in that class was born in 2013, which was the year I became premier. So
you share a history. Yeah.
We share a history, yeah. But they are the sweetest things, aren't they?
Yeah, oh, for sure. And we just welcomed Elliot to the clan 2 weeks ago. So now we have 4 grandbabies. We got the 2 boys in Toronto and the 2 girls in Nova Scotia. So we're
well. Happy birthday to Piper.
Yes, she's all excited. She was her mom was flashing up pictures to the family a message chain there this morning, and she got sprinkles on her toast for breakfast. So
there we go. What could be better?
Well, you know what's better? That she's got a little sister who managed to actually ride that wave. So Marigold got the sprinkles on her toast too. So it's a win-win, right? You know what? I know a lot of people will expect me to say Greenbelt to you in the context of this conversation. And if you don't mind, I'm going to put that off.
All good.
I think that there's a lot more to be listened to on that file yet. There's been much been said, certainly on this show and on the our On the Ledge program. But what I do want to get your insight into, and I'm not asking this from a political perspective, I'm asking it from somebody who sat in the chair. What's going through Doug Ford's head right now? What kind of grief, pressure, whatever, is he feeling?
Well, he's trying to manage all the personalities and all the pieces, right? There are a lot of moving parts. I don't know what his involvement was, Dave, so I can't really tell you what's going on in terms of the deep recesses of his own heart, but I know that he's trying to figure out how to navigate the public conversation, who he needs to be listening to. He's going to be getting a lot of advice from different people, mm-hmm. right? And he's got to sort through who are his most trusted advisors and who's he going to listen to. And I think they stumbled badly at the beginning in terms of not moving quickly enough on some of the removal of some of the people who were front and center. But again, I think you and I are going to have a chance to talk about this in the future. I don't think it's over. No. And so I think that he's trying to listen to the people who are going to help him anticipate what's going to come next so they can get ahead of it. That's the biggest thing. So,
again, and certainly everybody wants to equate the gas plants to Greenbelt. And quite frankly, I see why that happens. But let's face it, the Liberals were reelected twice after the gas plant situation happened. The electorate said, okay, we're going to live with that, and it's fine, whether you liked it or not.
Well, just on that, I was thinking about it yesterday because somebody was doing that equivalency on the radio. And, the fact is, what happened with the gas plants was the gas plants needed to be built. They were being built in a place that was wildly unpopular. We moved them, but we moved them way too late, and there was a cost associated with that because of canceling a contract, right? Changing a contract. So that's very different than promising to do something around the Greenbelt, doing the exact opposite, and doing it in a way that, that's highly suspicious and biased. So they're really not equivalent situations.
Yeah,
but I also get why they are compared.
Sure, and I think that's an easy, low-hanging fruit. May I suggest lazy way of looking at it? But anyway, the difference here, though, again, as I said, the Liberals more than survived that. You guys carried on and remained in government. But I got to wonder, going back to that. I mean, you were in the caucus and the cabinet at the time it happened. Eventually, you were elected as premier in the wake of it. What's the dynamic in the caucus when stuff like that happens?
Well, it's very much what I think was going on certainly in Ford's caucus. I mean, we read about it and I experienced it. People go home to their constituencies, they come back to Queen's Park, and they say, "This is all I'm hearing about." Like this is not going well, particularly in the gas plant issue. It was the GTA members who were hearing about us not responding to the community. Mm-hmm. And so the pressure, and we were in an election at that point. I don't know if you remember, we actually made that decision in the 2011 election. And so it was it was a high pressure time anyway, but there's a lot of unhappiness in the caucus. And I don't know how Doug Ford runs his caucus, but in our caucus, we were always free to say what we needed to say, and sometimes they were very challenging conversations, and that's what we were having in that period.
Yeah, I'm guessing there was some unvarnished conversation that went on in the Tory caucus in the last month or so, based on the way the premier withdrew his plan. So absolutely, there is power in the caucus, clearly,
for sure. And people, we always talk about cabinet. And cabinet being the critical place. And obviously it's very important, but caucus is so important because that's where the majority government sits. That's how you get elected as government, is having all those people return to their constituencies. So you got to listen to what's going on and pay attention to what people are saying.
I want to get into some of the bigger, broader issues that we've been talking about, but you just brought up the idea of making sure you listen to the folks who put an X beside your name. And that message came from Olivia Chow last night. I was at the Daily Bread Food Bank's annual general meeting, and the mayor was there and making her point, as we have heard over the last few months and certainly during the campaign, that we need affordable housing, we need to be advocates for all of this. The notion that each of us in the room needs to be knocking on the door of our local councillor, our elected members, our mayors, our MPPs, our MPs, etc., because we need to really underline how important it is to us to make sure that the elected officials understand that in fact, and Olivia Chow said this, you're my employer, essentially. So if I'm not listening, I'm not doing a good job. And it's easy to say that, and so when we look at some of the programs that we're talking about, and I've been doing a project with the Daily Bread Food Bank on the 2030 project, and we started looking at levels of poverty, only accentuated and highlighted and exacerbated by COVID. The number of visits to the food bank, just unimaginable. Mm-hmm. And Neil Hetherington last night was saying the food bank now spends something like $22 million a year on groceries, where it used to spend 1.5. Those are huge numbers.
Yeah.
How do we get our heads around that to effective solution with urgency?
Well, we have to do things differently, Dave. And I was part of our poverty reduction committee when Dalton was the premier, and we developed a poverty reduction strategy for Ontario. That's where the Ontario Child Benefit came from. And then when I became premier, we moved on a number of things. I mean, we increased the minimum wage, but that was towards the end of our term. But we also developed a panel. Munir Sheikh and Francis Lankin served on a panel to give us some advice about revising our social assistance programs. But also, I began a basic income pilot, because I think that if we keep doing the same things over and over again, and we're not getting ahead, then we got to try something different. And we're dealing with a bunch of different factors than we would have been, say, 40 years ago. So we're dealing with the displacement of people because of technology, right? So there are people who do not have work that they can engage in, and that's only going to increase as technology becomes more sophisticated. We made a decision a number of decades ago that we were going to shut down institutions, and I think that was the right decision. We decided we were going to be a more inclusive society, and we weren't going to warehouse people. We weren't going to put them away out of sight. But we did not respond as a society, and this is a national issue. We did not respond with the necessary support. So we've got people who 40 years ago might have been in an institution now living on the street, and that's a real challenge in terms of how we put the supports in place for those people. And right now, we're dealing with the aftermath of COVID and people having, either sunk into mental health challenges. We've got an opioid crisis that has been exacerbated, I think, by the isolation and the challenges in COVID. And so all of those things coming together, and then an economy that is making it difficult for people to make ends meet. So I think if we just say, well, we'll just keep doing what we've been doing for the last 50 years and it'll get better eventually, we're sadly mistaken. I remember listening to Gerard Kennedy decades ago when he was first with the food bank, and talking about how it should be a temporary solution. This is not something that should be permanent. It's now an institution. And when I listen to Neil Hetherington, I think the numbers have gone up like fourfold over the last year, just a year. So it is a crisis, and so that it's related to food insecurity. It's related to housing, the housing challenges that people have, but it's also related to mental health and those economic issues that people are dealing with. So it's why I was deputing to support a bill on basic income at the federal government, the Senate Finance Committee this week, because I think we got to try something different.
It's interesting. I was reading some commentary out of Peterborough, and we here in Toronto think this is a Toronto problem. It's not. It really is a problem that is affecting communities right across the country, and certainly, places like Peterborough and North Bay need to thrive. They need to, whether it's and when they face some of these pressures, we think we have a problem in Toronto. They have less capacity to deal with that, and it has more of an effect on some of those communities for recovery than we would ever have here in Toronto, as difficult as we think it may be.
Yeah, there are a couple of things about that. A lot of people from smaller centers, as you know, certainly young people who leave their homes for various reasons, they end up in the bigger centers because that's where the resources are. But you're absolutely right. I live in Alliston now, and my daughter lives in Orangeville. And, there's nothing like the kind of visible presence of poverty on the streets of those towns. But the fact is, people are struggling everywhere. And one of the things that I worry about when I drive around some of the country roads here, you wonder about rural poverty. Rural poverty can be much more silent, and people are. It's lovely to have the space, but people can be isolated from one another. And so I think sometimes we don't always know what the extent of the challenge is in some of the smaller centers. But you're right. When it starts to be visible, then you know that things have really gotten bad.
Yeah, in that column, I think it was in the Examiner, the Peterborough Examiner, talking about, if two people in a household make $130,000, that sounds like a lot of money. But even at that, they don't have enough to put down for the average cost of an average-sized home in Canada. Every time I read that number, I'm thinking, wow, how can we possibly get out in front of it? And the argument was, it can't be government flooding the market with cheap housing.
No.
Right? So back to your point about the guaranteed income. It's funny. I'll hear, diehard socialists like Jerry Agar say we need to have guaranteed income because it's less expensive to do that than to otherwise spend it on, disparate and unrelated or disconnected services. That's inefficient.
Yeah. And I was listening to some of the people who were delegating to the Senate committee this week, and we've got evidence from what's happening in British Columbia. There's been a cash program where people who are living on the street have been given $7,000. And what they're finding is that it actually helps them get off the street. It helps them. It is enough of a leg up. And I'm thinking maybe it's first and last month's rent or whatever it is. It helps them to take a step out of that really deep poverty. So we've got evidence from that. We've got evidence from, even though our basic income pilot in Ontario was canceled when the Ford government came in, there's anecdotal evidence about how people were, for example, able to get their car back on the road or get their truck back on the road so they could get back into the workforce, or they were able to buy some clothes in order to be able to go and apply for a job. We don't think about those things as necessarily big barriers, but they are, and they can keep someone home and isolated as opposed to actually in the workforce. So I think that I believe we have enough evidence from what we know about the top up that seniors who live in poverty get. So in old age security, in Ontario, there's a top up that you get, the guaranteed annual income supplement that you get if you are living below a certain level. And so we know that helps that population. We know that the Canada Child Benefit helps families with little kids, but there's this population from 18 to 64 that doesn't have those supports. And I'm not talking about everybody. I'm not actually a proponent of everybody getting an amount and then it being clawed back. I'm actually a proponent of the people who need it, get it, and those who don't. And I really believe, Dave, that we're going to have to look at some version of this. It was interesting when this CERB came in, so the $2,000 a month during the pandemic. I remember thinking, wow, so we believe $2,000 a month is what people need to live on. There's no social assistance program in the country that is $2,000 a month. And yet that was the number that the federal government came up with. So we are dreaming in Technicolor if we think that people can live on $1,000 a month in Toronto or Thunder Bay, And so we better decide whether we want those people actually able to look after themselves and their families or not. Because as you say, if we help as a society, people who are living below the whatever poverty line you decide, there are different measures. We will save money. We'll save money in terms of health costs. We'll save money in terms of lost education opportunity. And we'll save money in terms of all those other programs that get wrapped around people in a piecemeal way, as you say, that don't really help them. And so I just think that it makes sense. Whether we'll get there this round or not, I don't know, but we're going to have to get there at some point.
Yeah, I said I'm doing the show with the Daily Bread folks, and we've been focusing on the Canada Disability Act. And again, a national program, I think, is the issue here. But when I speak to the advocates and those with the lived experience, they live with disability, and they'll make the point that you made. $2,000 a month, it was just kind of out of the blue, and boom, look, it worked. And I can't blame them for being more than cynical when they say, as soon as it was finished, it was withdrawn. And the only reason government acted is because it affected people who were well and securely employed.
Right.
It did not address their needs specifically because they're disabled and can't work. So let me take you back to, the 15 years of Liberal government. I get that Mike Harris takes it in the neck on ODSP because he was the one that really kind of pulled it all back. But where was the decision along the line to say we are going to leave it as is for the most part without really addressing the issue that you rightly bring up? That's no living benefit.
Yeah. So we didn't leave it where it was. We made changes. For example, we made changes around the assets that people could have. We made changes around how much money people could keep if they were working. So we actually did make changes, and we put increases in place. You're right, we didn't restore the 21%. And there were lots of arguments about that and why we didn't do that, why we should have. I think
should you have done that? Should you? Looking back now, should you have really put money in where it counted?
I think that we should have over our term done more. Yeah, I think that's true. And I, not to be defensive, but that's exactly why when I became premier, I was looking for other solutions. So, for example, when Dalton was the premier, and we asked as a government that Francis Lankin and Munir Sheikh do this review of our social assistance program, we didn't ask them to tackle the issue of adequacy of the amounts, and we should have. Mm-hmm. And so, but we tried to do other things. We made small increases on an annual basis. We, as I said, we changed the assets. We worked to put more money into the community as we shut down some of those institutions, because we knew that those were people who were going to be living in poverty once they came out of the institutions, and we put more money into support programs. But I think we could argue that every government in the country should have done more.
No question. No question.
Years, and I'm not proud of the fact that we didn't come up with more solutions. I'm not proud of the fact that I didn't, as soon as I was premier, get that basic income pilot in place, and so we could have had the evidence. I wish I had done that right at the beginning. You do things when it's possible to do them in the context that you're working in. But if I had it to do over again, Dave, I would have pushed harder for more increases while I was in the cabinet, and B, when I was premier, I would have gotten going on that more radical solution or more transformative solution to support earlier on in my mandate.
And as I've sort of done my research and interviews and listening on the Canada Disability Benefit, again, back to the need for a national program. But here's the challenge: who qualifies for the national program? When Alberta might have the highest premium for disabilities in the country, but it's really, really hard to qualify.
Right.
So right. There's these inequities all through the system that are supposed to level the playing field. So I don't know if the feds are the ones who are equipped to comb all those knots out or not, but certainly the provinces have kind of taken their own tack. But let me ask you this: when you sit down in front of the Senate and you make your deputation, you've got to acknowledge that the circumstances in Greater Toronto Area or Ontario are different than they are in New Brunswick. So that has to be baked into this, doesn't it, somehow?
Well, that's why this bill that I was speaking to, S-233, that was put forward by Senator Kim Pate, is about developing a national framework. So which is what they're doing with the disability benefit, right? Exactly. Yeah. So it's about doing the consultation across the country, and then the way I would envision it would be that the federal government would work province by province, because you're right, the circumstances are different. I don't know that they're necessarily worse or better depending on where you are, because every region has its own challenges, So I would see that there would have to be a buy-in province by province on exactly what it would look like and what the province was willing to do. But I think without that national conversation, it's going to be more piecemeal and more problematic than it needs to be, right? And I think, Dave, and I've sat at the table with all the other premiers, I think if this were an issue that was raised at the table among the premiers, I think it'd be a really interesting conversation. Now, I don't know whether that will happen. There are a lot of conservative premiers in the country right now, and for whatever reason, this is not seen as a conservative solution, a basic income, even though It as you say, if people like Jerry Agar can get on side with it, and it was Hugh Siegel's life work was to get a guaranteed annual income in place. So I think it would be a really good conversation for the premiers to have around that table, and then they could then approach the prime minister. If it came from both sides, so you've got the Senate working on it. There is also a bill going through, a private member's bill going through the House of Commons. I think there could be some momentum that would build if the premiers who were supportive started to talk about this at their table and look to the federal government. Like, how could the federal government support it? How could there be a shared responsibility for this? One of the problems that we have with the discussion about this and other social programs is it's really hard to get the finance guys to quantify the savings, right? So the parliamentary budget officer spoke before me when I was talking at the Senate, and he said, we didn't look at the cost offsets. We didn't look at what you'd save in terms of health costs. Well, actually, we have to look at that. We have to talk about that. Because if you're living on the street in Toronto or in Newfoundland, or I don't care where in this country, in the middle of winter, maybe not in Victoria, but if you're living on the street in the middle of winter, your health risks are way, way higher than they would be if you were living somewhere where the climate was warmer. So we better talk about how many times you're going to end up in the emergency room just because it's so freaking cold, Yep. And that's a warm place to go. My daughter's an emerge nurse, and I know for sure that there are people who go to the emergency room in the middle of winter because it's just so cold outside.
Yeah, my wife spent a career at St. Mike's Hospital in downtown Toronto, and that ER was, you're right, there were the usual suspects who came in for whatever reason, but you're right, that was the place to stay warm and sheltered.
And can you blame them?
No, of course, there's nothing else there for them. I mean, the number I throw out, and it comes from Feed Ontario, and this is a pre-COVID number, the cost of poverty in Ontario alone, when you count all the services and lost job productivity, is $33 billion a year. What did you do with that?
The national number is $80 billion.
Yeah.
It's $80 billion, Dave. So, $80 billion would go a long way in terms of providing some support for people that would keep them decently. And, the food bank numbers are really disturbing in absolute terms, but they're particularly disturbing because of the number of people who are working.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Oh, entirely.
Right?
Yep.
They are not people who are indigent. They are not people who don't have employment. They are working one or sometimes two jobs. And so that's a huge failure on the part of society and corporations. And, when we raised the minimum wage in 2017-18, we raised it to $14 an hour. And there was a hue and cry from businesses that they couldn't afford it. There was barely a ripple in terms of the employment. In fact, jobs numbers continued to go up. So we can't discount that part of the equation as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Entirely.
That corporate Canada has a responsibility that it has abdicated for a couple of generations now to make sure that people are paid a living wage. So that's a whole other subject, but it is part of the equation.
As I said, I was at the AGM for the Daily Bread Food Bank. I was showing up early, just taking care of some stuff. Buddies and I, we were playing the music for the party, so it was fun. But I arrived early, and there was a lineup of young families at the New Toronto Street site. So if you don't understand that, just go and visit a food bank in your neighborhood. You'll get a really clear, unvarnished view of who is in need. 270,000 visits a month.
Yeah. Up from 69 or something, right?
Yeah, which was bad enough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
So it's crazy. Listen, this is great. You've opened the door for a whole lot of other conversations, so maybe we'll have to do this again.
Pleasure. And again, happy birthday to your grandbaby.
Thank you. Kathleen Wynne.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. That one next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.